The Bugler, The Ghosts of Culloden, Moor, Book 24, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Chapter 1. Castle Beaufort, early September, 1745. Late in the gloaming, with stars sharpening their blades in the skies above Beaufort Castle, Morey Fraser of the Boll of Meal Frasers wasted little attention on the flock of sheep under his protection. He was generally a miserable shepherd, not that it required much on his part, but the misery had more to do with his resentment for his assignment, and not his lack of talent, for there was little talent required. Remain awake, order the dogs about, keep from losing an animal. The care and feeding of the woolly beasts fell to those who were lucky enough to sleep in their beds at night, so Morey knew his job was the more preferable of the two, but he couldn't help feeling that the duty was beneath him. He'd spent every free moment honing his true skill, as a bugler and otherwise, and expected that someday he'd be appreciated for them. Unfortunately, there was only one thing he was allowed to practice while on duty, and it wasn't bugling. His music, and yes, it was music, no matter what his cousins claimed, frightened the beasts day or night, and since the sound travelled a good 3 miles, he would be beaten soundly if he woke anyone important at the castle while practising after dark. Thus, it was no fault of his own that he chose to spend his evenings practising his other true talent, an ability that also required a nimble set of lips, teaching a lass how to kiss properly. In truth, it might have been his greatest skill of all, but it was difficult to judge the two against each other. But a talent for tending sheep? Bah! Reclined in the soft grass, face to face with Milly McGuiles, he placed a finger under her jawline and gently pressed her opposite temple to demonstrate the optimum angle for tilting one's head. But their tutoring session was interrupted by the huff and puff of someone hurrying up the hillside. Embarrassed, Milly pulled her feet beneath her, scurried headlong into the flock of sleeping sheep, and disappeared. Morey hoped that when she emerged, she wouldn't be covered in dung. It might mean the end of the evening. "Morey Fraser!" Morey stood and faced the shadowed but unmistakable form of his taller, handsomer cousin, Sween. It was a trial to be friends with such a prime competitor for young female attention. Even his name meant sublime. But as far as cousins went, they got on well. "For pity's sake, stay where you are, Milly." Morey started down the hill and hoped the lass wouldn't recognise Sween's voice. "What brings you to me, cousin?" "The fox himself has sent for ye, Morey." The handsome face was lit with more than just exertion. "You're to bring your horn, aye." "My bugle?" "Aye, what else?" His cousin's attention was drawn further up the hill, and he frowned. "Is that Milly McGuiles, then?" Morey glowered, but Sween wasn't watching him. "Aye," he hissed. "Who else?" His cousin lifted a brow at his tone. It was clear he didn't believe Morey had any claim on the lass. After all, Sween had caught him kissing Agnes McNully in the larder just that morning. "Lord Lovat is waiting," Sween reminded. "But dinna fash. I'm to see to your, flock." Morey looked over his shoulder and found Milly hurrying down the slope with her lower lip caught between her teeth. Apparently, the lass wasn't too humiliated to face his tall cousin. "Dinna fash on my account, Morey," she said, panting. "I'm certain Sween will be willing to help me." Sween nodded and grinned. "Anything you need, Milly, anything at all." The two were all but licking their lips before Morey had taken a dozen steps, but he took great solace in the sight of Sween's bold hand moving toward Milly's hip, where a thick, dark smear awaited. Chapter 2. The sight of Simon the Fox, the 11th Lord Lovat, was both exciting and terrifying. From a distance he was impressively tall, Up close, he was terrifying. His greying eyebrows sat on his forehead like gnarled watchdogs that jumped about at every sound. His ears cocked smartly as his head turned this way and that, listening, assessing, a cannier man Morey never expected to meet. Choosing the wrong words, if one was allowed to speak in his presence at all, could earn a man a month in the dungeon, or swat to the ear that might leave him deaf for the rest of his days. For most of the clan, speaking to their laird would never be necessary, but for Morey the test was at hand. "Morey Fraser," announced Hertford, the laird's man. The grizzled head swivelled toward the doorway where Morey stood, quaking in his boots. "To me, laddie, dinna be afeard." The greying whiskers twisted into an unnatural smile that insinuated fear was surely the wiser choice. "Say ye brought your horn along." "I did, your lordship." Morey held the bugle out between them as he neared the large seat with its tall back to the cold hearth. Though it might have looked as if he were using the instrument as a shield, it felt as though he were offering up his very heart for his lord to do with what he would. "Good lad." The man's huge hand clapped him on the shoulder, and Morey had to hop to keep his balance. "Your grandfather taught you all the calls, I hear." "Aye, sir, every one." Lovat took the horn from his hands and turned it over, this way and that, as if it were the Holy Grail itself. Morey glanced at the valet to guess what might be coming next, but the man's expression was as blank as a windless lock. Another man, not of their clan, stood off to the right, stiff and official. His fingers, hanging next to his trousers, fidgeted nervously. Lovat grunted, noticing Morey's inaction. Wide-eyed and blushing, Morey faced the laird and those eyebrows again. "A scrawny lad like ye," Lovat gestured toward his body. "I doubt ye can make much noise. You're likely too young to have much talent at it, aye." The moment was at hand. At last he would be relieved of shepherd duties, and he'd be appreciated for the skills he'd honed. Climbing all those hills in order to practice in peace will have been worth it after all. Morey lifted his chin slightly. "My grandfather was the finest trumpeter, my lord, as is my father." "Your father abandoned the clan, lad. To us he's dead. Do not speak of the dead." Lovat pulled his arm back, as he often punctuated his orders with a blow. But he hesitated, then scratched his shoulder, as if he'd never meant to do anything else. The nervous visitor exhaled rather loudly in relief. "Forgive me, lord, I meant to say—" Morey hoped Lovat would appreciate boldness. "I am as fine a bugler as my grandsire, sir, perhaps better." The bugle slapped against his stomach with just enough force to take his breath away. It took a few seconds to realise Lovat was merely handing it back to him. "That'll do," the man said. "I mean to give ye to Master General John Campbell, no doubt the future Duke of Argyll, and a good bugler." He smirked. "Let alone a fine one is a boon Campbell canna ignore. You leave with this gentleman." He gestured to the stranger. "Meet him at the gate in 10 minutes. 10 minutes? There were so many questions flying around inside his head, he could not latch on to one. But Lovat levelled him with a fiery glare that might have lit up the hearth behind him, whether or no a stick of wood had been laid. So Morey took a step backward, bowed and hurried out the door, half expecting Simon the Fox to ride his heels for the next 9.5 minutes of his life. The road was as dark as the bottom of a loch on a stormy eve. The horses had to pick their way. Morey and his companion had to be patient. One of those questions that had been flying around in Morey's head finally landed on his tongue, and he turned to Argyll's man, Sergeant Gregory Campbell, for the answer. "Is it true that the Duke of Argyll and the Campbells will fight again for the English?" The man frowned in his best imitation of Lord Lovat, but fell well short. not with the English, but with the British government. You best try to remember we are all British. Life under Argyle would prove punishing if you canna." The man had been frowning long before they'd left Beaufort Castle behind them, grumbling over the lack of Fraser hospitality, and though it seemed Lovat was in a hurry to have Morey delivered to the Duke, the man charged with that delivery wanted a meal and a bed, so they made it only as far as the Albaburn Coaching Inn, before Sergeant Campbell insisted he had suffered the saddle long enough for one day. The rooms were well appointed in spite of the slant walls. The stew was hot and plentiful, the beds well stuffed, but Morey could not quiet his mind enough to sleep. As a virtual orphan and the sole son of a sole son, he'd said very few further wells, and with so many already abed for the night, there'd be nary a lass to shed a tear over his leaving. To ease his disappointment, however, he closed his eyes and imagined a long row of weeping females lined up in the morning, casting mournful glances out the castle gate. It stood to reason, however, that if they started exchanging tales about a certain sheepherder, he wouldn't be missed for long. Well, best to look forward, then, to his new life as a military musician, a life in which he would be afforded the respect he deserved. And if anyone asked if he knew much about sheep, he would admit only that he was not fond of mutton. A worrisome question niggled at him just as he was beginning to relax. To point if Argyle fought for the British government, and Lord Lovat refrained from choosing sides as he had done thus far, Morey had little to worry over. He would perform his duty, and in so doing would bring honour to the Fraser name and clan. However, what if Lord Lovat was to be swayed to join the Jacobites? The man changed alliances with the shifting of the wind, the rising of the sun. If Prince Charles Stuart were favoured to win the crown for his father, Simon the Fox would hurry to his side, no question. So if Morey were to be found amongst the government troops in some battle, would that make him a traitor? He shook his head and fluffed his pillow, then conjured a scene in his mind to quiet his fears. Bonny Prince Charlie sits on a throne. Morey kneels before an executioner, with one cheek resting against the block. The blade lifts. Lord Lovat rushes in and demands Morey be released, that the bugler only followed orders, and that he, Simon Fraser, had given him as a gift to the enemy. With a wave of a gold-laden hand, the prince frees Morey. Then he points to the block and waits for Simon to fill the vacancy. Morey pulled cool air deep into his lungs and let it out again, and decided, at least for that night, he would pretend Lord Lovat might care so much about the life of one possibly fine bugler. Chapter 3. Though the Duke of Argyle's name might have inspired awe, his home was far less impressive than Morey had expected. Instead of an imposing castle, Inverary was a dilapidated tower house in the centre of a sprawling village, and was in the process of being dismantled. Ramshackle houses lining a small hill looked like a trail of broken, whitewashed sticks poured slowly from a bucket, and, to Morey's disappointment, they turned out to be the barracks for Argyle's growing army. "They'll be laying the foundation of the new castle in a bit," the sergeant said, as they reached the outskirts of town late in the afternoon. Gravity pulled the sun toward an orange and pink horizon. The townsfolk appeared to move leisurely from boardwalk to boardwalk, either because of the rush of the day was behind them, or life in Inverary was more peaceful than Beaufort. "Though ye should be proud enough to be joining the 21st Royal British Fusilier Regiment of Foot," the man continued, "you'll be doubly proud once the castle is complete. I've seen the renderings." The man's chest inflated, as if he'd been gifted with a rare treat. Morey couldn't help but wonder if the renovations to Inverary might have much to do with which side of the Jacobite rising the Duke had pledged his allegiance to, but he wasn't foolish enough to mention it. Their destination was not the row of shacks along the hillside, however, but a long wooden structure that resembled a legendary Viking hall with a traditional Scottish roof of weathered grey heller. The pine walls still looked fresh, however, as if the hall might have been constructed in the past month, round about the time bonny Prince Charlie arrived in the Western Isles. Inside the hall was dark and cool, and though Morey would have liked to clean up a wee bit before meeting Master General John Campbell, such was not the case. A large hatch in the roof was propped open by a 20-foot-long pike that stood beside Campbell's chair like some sort of sceptre. A bright, white ray of light lit the man from above, along with hundreds of drifting motes of dust. Altogether it gave the appearance that heaven itself was raining down blessing upon the man's head. 5 men shuffled back and forth between Campbell's chair and a long table covered with papers and large maps. Every time a map was opened and presented for the man's inspection, those dust motes danced. Morey was grateful when the sergeant seemed in no hurry to approach the assembly. If John Campbell was anything like Simon Fraser, their interruption wouldn't be welcomed. Unfortunately, one of the men noticed Morey and tapped the Master General on the arm. He looked up with a forbidding frown on his face, but his visage cleared immediately when he laid eyes on the sergeant. "Sergeant, come!" He waved enthusiastically while he eyed Morey. His brows rose when he noticed the bugle tucked beneath his arm. "What have we here?" "Master General," Gregory Campbell bowed. "Lord Lovat regrets that he is unable to send men at this time. He claims his troops are fighting amongst themselves, and he dare not send you any man, for fear of planting a Jacobite sympathiser among your ranks." Campbell snorted as if he wasn't surprised in the least. "I wondered how he might weasel out of his promise." He smiled at Morey. "And what about ye, my young friend? Can I trust that ye have no Jacobite sympathies, then?" "Lovat sends you this fine bugler," the sergeant said with a wink. "Morey Fraser is his name, and Lovat insists he's worth 100 farmers." Campbell lifted a brow and squinted, obviously waiting for Morey to answer his question. But there was nothing threatening in his demeanour. In fact, Morey had the impression he could speak plainly and not be clouted upside the head for it. "Master General, sir, I can only say that I've no ken where my sympathies lie. With Scotland, I suppose, for who am I to say who should be king of it? I play my horn and kiss—" He swallowed. "And kiss a lass now and again, but politics have naught to do with me." Campbell chuckled. "Naught to do with ye?" He wagged his head from side to side, unbelieving. "It is politics that has taken ye from the Highlands, young fellow, and, as a bugler, it shall be politics that rule the remainder of your life. Let us hope it is a long one." It was no secret that musicians in the military, be they drummers, pipers or buglers, were an easy target for the enemy. They brought attention to themselves with each and every note they played, besides the bright colours they were expected to wear. If it weren't for the relative peace of the times, Morey doubted his grandsire and sire would have lived as long as they had, so the hint of regret he read in Campbell's eyes was not missed. The Master General turned to Morey's escort. "Sergeant, see him settled in. If he's not over-weary, bring him to my table this evening." To Morey he said, "Welcome, Morey Fraser, and the rest quickly, for we've just had word that the Jacobites have taken Edinburgh." Chapter 4. Morey soon learned why the Jacobite overthrow of Edinburgh meant little rest for himself. When he left the hall, he found that all those Campbells who had ambled around towns less than an hour before were now running flat out from place to place. No pleasantries exchanged, no smiles, just an eerie quiet amid the pandemonium. The army, it seemed, was preparing to leave, and they'd be taking their musicians along with them. Rest quickly indeed. A private showed Morey to the bathing-house. After a quick wash, he was then shown to the cottage he would be sharing with the drummers, at least for that night. They were expected to muster early the following morning and head north around the end of Loch Fyne, then south and east toward Edinburgh. He was relieved. At least he wouldn't be retracing the same route he'd travelled to Inverary. Reston had to wait until after supper. Gregory Campbell turned out to be a nephew of the Duke's, and was comfortable joining his uncle and his generals at a round table at the far end of the Viking Hall. Morey was naturally nervous when he was introduced to the Duke, but the way he'd been treated thus far kept him optimistic. Small fires burning along one wall lit the faces of dozens of people who might have been hidden earlier by shadows. All ears seemed to strain in Argyll's direction, but he seemed content to let the younger men bliller. John Campbell and his generals spoke amiably of innocuous things. Either their plans had already been settled, or they didn't trust all those ears with their upcoming plans. By the end of the meal, Morey had to acknowledge 4 things. First, the Campbell lasses were every bit as pretty as those of Clan Fraser. Second, they had a sobriety about them he imagined he could rectify. Third, and having naught to do with lasses at all, Morey liked the Major General, and the Duke for that matter. Fourth, and most unsettling, was the fact that he didn't want to like them. The massacre at Glencoe had occurred 12 years before Morey was born, though it was a direct result of the first Jacobite rising when James Stuart made his final attempt to regain his own throne. The incident itself was sometimes consigned to a feud between the Campbell and MacDonald clans. It was a history that had nothing to do with Morey Fraser's life, at least until that night. And, strictly speaking, the current Duke of Argyll had not been head of Clan Campbell when the massacre was ordered. But still, sitting at their table, he imagined that the ghosts of many a MacDonald were pounding on the outside of the new pine walls, warning him to flee. After the generals had retired, Morey wandered along the other tables where the younger officers had finished their meals. Among them he found the drummers Mars and Dallas, and another Campbell bugler named Cooper. They were welcoming enough, but there was something about Cooper that seemed familiar. He just couldn't imagine what it might be. He watched the bugler for a long while, then gave up altogether. "I'll gie you fair warning," Mars said. "Dinna get in between Cooper and the lasses, and you'll get on well enough, aye." He and Dallas had a good chuckle. Cooper gave Morey a pointed look that said the drummer's advice should be heeded. Then he went back to doing what he'd been doing, carrying on a silent conversation with one of the lasses burdened with refilling their cups. Dallas elbowed Morey and gestured to Cooper. "Believes his lips are made of gold, he does." He laughed, then sobered, looking closely at Morey's mouth. "Mars, do you think all buglers believe the same?" Morey rolled his eyes and laughed, but when the conversation moved on to what the next battle might hold in store, he couldn't help watching Cooper observe the lasses. Understanding dawned, like the realization one's stomach's contents are about to reappear. In fact, he worried his own stomach was about to turn, and hard, when he understood why Cooper seemed familiar. There was nothing about the man's face that Morey recognised. Nothing about his expression either, even as he waited for the lass to meet his gaze. Rather, what was familiar to Morey was the knowledge of what that expression felt like from the inside. How many times had he looked out of those eyes, waiting in anticipation for the lass's gaze to meet his, so he could begin coaxing her toward his spider's web. For that was what Cooper resembled, a spider lying in wait, spinning in anticipation of the catch. A tickle of a shiver ran up his spine and into his left ear, not unlike a speedy insect, and he swatted at the sensation. Were he and Cooper so similar? Back home with the Frasers, had he been so obvious? Of course he had. Had he given a fig? Not one. But seeing it now, from the other side of that mask, made him ill. You think old buglers believe their lips are golden? Morey stood and obeyed an uncontrollable urge to put distance between himself and himself. A captain appeared and shooed the lasses away, told them to take their pictures with them. Then he gave the soldiers a meaningful look and nodded to the door. As one, the lot of them jumped to their feet and shuffled toward the opening. While Morey waited for his chance to exit the hall, he noticed Cooper staring at him, grinning. Morey frowned at the fellow, but the bugler only grinned wider. "You can have their hearts, Fraser, but only after I'm done with the rest of them." Chapter 5. Reluctant to find himself locked in with Cooper for the night, Morey set out for a large cairn he remembered passing before he and the sergeant had entered town. Cutting back to the north and east, he found the mound much sooner than expected, but just as he remembered, folks moved their carts and horses around it, with few of them bothering to glance up, and short of striking out into an unknown countryside, the knoll was the closest thing to privacy he was likely to find. It was passing strange how different was the view from 20-some-odd feet above the toiling masses. With hands on hips he turned in a circle, feeling quite the king of the hill, until he realised he was not alone. Sitting with her back to him was the lass whom Cooper had been eyeing in the large hall. She was just settling her skirts around her when she glanced over her shoulder. She jumped to her feet like a frightened but defiant rabbit and looked down her nose at him. "How dare ye?" "I didn't follow ye, lass, upon my honour." How many times had he said something similar, with no honour in mind at all? "Easy now." He held out his hands to stay her. "Dinna fash, I'll just go along my way and leave ye in peace." She nodded, then eyed him up and down. "He'll tell Cooper where to find me." "He's the last man I'd say aught to this night, and on the morrow he'll be gone." She nodded again, less stiff this time. "If I wouldn't be scalped for it, I'd wait right here until the last red tail of ye is gone." He grimaced and nodded, finally understanding just a little of the distrust he'd sown back home. And that row of lasses he'd imagined mourning his loss, casting wistful glances out the castle gate. He now grasped the probability that some were spitting on his footsteps and dancing in his wake. "The safest place for ye now, with the gloaming a-coming, is behind a locked door. Go on with ye." He stepped aside and gestured back toward the town. Surely there was somewhere for the lass to hide from any man, not just Cooper, who might be inclined to kiss the lassie's farewell before morning. The young woman gave him a strange look and a wide berth as she flew past him on bare feet. No doubt his own expression showed similar surprise. Imagine Morey Fraser letting a pretty lass slip away from him unkissed. And what was more, he'd told her to go. When he'd left Beaufort 2 days ago, he'd been prepared for a drastic change in his life, but he'd been thinking of his new station as a bugler for a general who didn't rely on Highland pipers to communicate orders. He hadn't considered that his deportment and sensibilities towards women might be changed, and all since supper. He'd been looking forward to new adventures that wouldn't include the counting of sheep, doing what God had put him on earth to do. There was a destiny awaiting him as he scurried down the hill toward his meeting with Lord Lovat. He tasted it on his tongue with every gasp of his breath on that cool summer's night, anticipating a grand assignment that only he could do. But he hadn't imagined that in leaving Millie McGuire's behind, he would also be leaving his old self, that lad who used to resemble Cooper in more ways than he would like to think on. Sitting there on the knoll that might well be the cairn of some long-ago king, with no other company than the stars spread out above him, he felt new. He felt like a man newly repented. He could also imagine returning to his home in the north once the stramash was over and stumbling upon a dried husk of his old self, like a skin shed from the snake he used to be. The question was this: would he feel the same come morning? Would he wake without a memory of the fullness now pressing from inside his chest? While he slept, would he fail to recall what a new beginning felt like? And at the first sight of a pretty lass, would he see only her lips and wonder how he might manoeuvre them until they were pressed against his own? He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, and after repeating the action a handful of times, he finally whispered to himself, "I'll not forget, I'll not forget, I'll not forget." Chapter 6. Half an hour later, Morey tried to retrace his steps to the cottage he'd been assigned, but failed. With no one about and no other alternative, he returned to the bathhouse and started from there. The route remembered, he struck out for his temporary home, but when he'd not gone a dozen paces, he heard a splash and a muffled scream. His stomach plummeted, and he hurried back to the bathhouse. The door was locked, and though he'd heard nothing from inside, he took no chances. He lowered his shoulder and barreled through the slat door. He was able to stop his momentum just as his toes tilted over an unseen edge. The large room was dark as pitch. The air was heavy with a day's worth of steam. He held perfectly still and listened. Water sloshed and snapped at its confines, then settled again. If someone were being held beneath the surface, there was no time for games. He spoke forcefully. "Who goes there?" Laughter answered him. "Fraser." "Aye, and I need a light." There was a swoosh of water and a woman's panicked gasp. After a few breaths she screamed, but the sound was muffled. She still breathed, though she struggled to do so. "Cooper!" The man laughed again. "Aye, wheesht now. Come and join us." "Oh, I will." Morey stepped back to the doorway that was only a square of blue amid so much black. "Culloden!" he yelled with all his might. "Culloden!" It was the war cry of the Campbells. Cooper cursed. The lass screamed again, though the blackguard still had to be covering her mouth with his hand. If she didn't cease, he'd be putting her back onto the water to silence her. Morey retrieved a door plank from the floor and beat on the wall until he heard voices raised in alarm. He tossed the board out the door and moved deeper into the room, feeling with his feet before placing each hurried step, his ears straining for a direction to follow. Cooper cursed again and moved to the left. The lass's gasps moved to the right. Morey followed her, bending and groping, determined to pull her from the water if he could only find her. The slosh of Cooper's wet steps circled along the walls, but he had to know the lass was safe before he worried about defending himself or punishing the offender. He found her hand. She pulled away. "To me, lass," he urged. An approaching torch lent the room an orange glow. The lass clutched at him, and he looked down into her terror-filled eyes. Without warning, he was viciously shoved to the left and could do nothing to prevent falling across the rims of 4 massive barrels that filled a large hole in the floor. His ribs fairly cracked against their rigid edges. His legs slammed into the water. Gravity pulled his boots to the bottom of the barrel in which the lass flailed. He manoeuvred himself around, prepared to face the mob he'd roused, and tried to shield the lass from their view. Cooper, too, faced the door, where a number of men jostled each other for position. A major pushed through them all and took control. "I thank God you heard me," Cooper said dramatically. "I found our new trumpeter trying to drown the lass." "Nay," the girl pushed around Morey. "Nay, it was Cooper who tried to drown me when I refused his attentions. It was Cooper. This one saved me. Cooper pushed him in." Though the villain attempted to speak over her denials, the lass had voice enough to be heard. The major sent for his commander. Morey and Cooper were ordered to stay put along with the woman. 2 guards were posted at the door along with the light. The interior of the bathing house was left in shadow once more. "Remember, lass," Cooper purred, "you came inside of your own free will." "I didn't," she said quietly at Morey's back. He found her hand on the rim and gave it a squeeze. It might have been 10 minutes later when the yard lit up like midday. The warm light of innumerable torches was accompanied by the slap of many a leather boot and a gasp or 2 from the guards. One of them stepped inside smartly, carrying a torch and holding it out to light the bathhouse. The Master General himself followed. Not a whisker could be found on his jaw, not a button was missing from his uniform. The red cloth fairly glowed beside the orange flame. It took a moment for him to take in the scene. Morey stood at attention, but lifted one arm to shield the wet lass from all eyes. Thankfully, she didn't fight him. "Explain to me why the entire camp has lost their last good sleep, Cooper, or did you think it amusing to practice the battle cry at this hour?" Cooper lifted his chin. "Nay, sir, I heard the last scream." "Bollocks." Morey's matter-of-fact denial filled the room, carrying clearly across the full barrels of water. Cooper's lies were ignored as John Campbell turned his full attention to his new bugler. "You will have your turn, Mr. Fraser, as will the lass." He faced Cooper again. "So I suggest ye choose your words carefully." "It was all my fault," Cooper began, surprising everyone present. Even the guards' brows lifted. "I caught them in a tryst, you see, and believing the lass was being drowned, I called for help. Now, in their embarrassment, they mean to make a villain of me." "All bollocks," Morey elaborated, not waiting for permission. He might have gone right on elaborating had the Master General not levied a scowl at him. The man sighed and clicked his fingers. When an ensign appeared, he sent the soldier to fetch a cloak for the lass. After another warning glare, Campbell tilted his head. "Lass, are you harmed?" "Nay, your lordship." Her shivering was evident in her words and the ripples in the water at Morey's back. "I've sent for a cloak. We'll have you warmed up in no time. But give me the truth. Did one of these men try to drown ye in earnest?" She nodded soberly. "Cooper, sir." "And if I warn you that the man's life is at stake, would you change your answer?" "She has spoken the truth," Morey said. "I beg you not to burden her with the man's fate." Campbell nodded, then gestured toward the doorway. 2 soldiers stepped inside and took hold of Cooper's arms. "We are at war, soldier." The Master General stepped closer to the villain and narrowed his eyes. "Do you ken what that means?" "Forgive me, sir, but the lass lies. She's been making cow eyes at me ever since. It means not only do we not have time for a proper trial, sir, but also that I do not require one." Campbell stepped smartly back, heels barely missing the edge of the platform where the hole had been made for the barrels. He tilted his head and addressed the doorway. "Send for the minister." He pulled out a pocket watch, frowned, then replaced it in his uniform. "Hang him at the top of the hour." He showed no emotion while the guards forced the distraught Cooper out of the door, then smiled politely and allowed a woman through with a cloak draped across her arms. He faced the rear wall while the lass was helped from the water. After she was led outside, he faced Morey. "Fraser." "Aye, Master General. I hope you're as fine as Lovat claims. Come 3 o'clock, you'll be my only bugler." Chapter 7. Morey witnessed the execution, though he took no pleasure in it. Rather, he hoped that watching his reflection hang would serve as a measure of penance for his own sins. Though he'd never assaulted a young woman, let alone tried to kill one, he'd taken more liberties than he ought to have done. And the sheep he'd been counting above the towers of Beaufort Castle weren't the sheep he should have been protecting. 2 guards escorted Cooper across the yard. Their grip on his arms meant they didn't trust him to cooperate, but he seemed defeated. His nostrils pulsed as he tried to keep his emotions in check. Morey was certain he could taste fear in the air and wondered if it might be coming from himself. The steps to the scaffold were wide to accommodate Cooper and both escorts. Obviously, he wasn't the first to fight against his death sentence. The torches burned silently. Curious soldiers watched the prisoner's progression, and Morey suddenly understood what they were hearing. With each step the bugler took, water squelched in his boots. At the bottom of the steps, the guards gave him a few seconds to screw up his courage, then forced him to climb. To anyone not watching closely, they might have missed his resistance, but the hands gripping his shoulders kept the struggle to a minimum, and Morey wondered just how many men the guards had escorted to their deaths. Squeak, squeak, squeak. 9 steps Cooper climbed to meet his executioner. 9 steps that Morey felt slide beneath his own boots as if he climbed them too. But the other bugler's fate would not be his. The memory of Cooper's shiny boots twitching in the torchlight would serve as a reminder that Morey was a changed man. One day, Morey Fraser would return to Beaufort and beg forgiveness from every lass in the village to be certain he didn't miss anyone. For the 10 days following their departure from Inverary, Morey refused to speak of the incident in the bathhouse or the hanging that followed. But his reluctance was misinterpreted as gentlemanly conduct, and he ultimately enjoyed a measure of respect he'd never truly earned. But he was in no hurry to disabuse anyone. The other musicians and officers treated him as an equal, although at 19 years he was the youngest among them. And as time went along, the sound of the Campbell name became familiar to his ears, and he no longer thought of the massacre at Glencoe when he heard it, at least not every time. And since his own name was said with an air of veneration, he was hopeful he would come to earn that respect in truth and bring honour to his own clan once the rising ended. That was until the Battle of Muir at Prestonpans. Cope's forces, it said, fled in the face of the raw fury of the Highland charge. But it was the influence of the Highland papers that caught Morey's attention. With every recounting of the battle, he heard how the skirl of the pipes split in the morning mist struck fear into every heart and sent officers fleeing ahead of their men. Of course, the latter details were never repeated within the general's hearing, but repeated nevertheless. and it wasn't the first time in Morey Fraser's life he wished his grandsire had been a piper and not a trumpeter. No laird would have given away a piper. The defeat of the Hanoverian forces at Preston Pans affected everyone, including Morey, but the real blow came when he heard that Simon the Fox, Lord Lovat himself, had been so impressed with the Jacobites' performance he'd openly declared his support for Prince Charles Stuart. The man who placed bets only when he couldn't lose had bet on James Stuart regaining the crown. And if that didn't convince the British army they were doomed, he didn't know what would. Thus, in one resounding victory, the Highlanders had brought about the worst possible scenario for a lone Fraser among the Royal Fusiliers. A Fraser on the wrong side of the war. A Fraser that wouldn't be welcomed home again, no matter the state of his soul. A Fraser that might well find himself staring across a battlefield at his own kin. "Dinna fash," Morris told him when he learned what ailed his favourite bugler. "'Tis unlikely you'll be required to strike down one of your own kin. 2 large armies, what are the chances?" He smiled and slapped Morey's chest as he passed the chair in which Morey had been moaning in his buttermilk since he'd heard the news at breakfast. "Save your worry for the day you pull your horn away and find your lips are still attached to it." As an integral part of the military machine, Morey trod an easy path. He ate with the officers and was given a dry billet off the damp ground. The only thing required of him was to spend the day within sight and hearing of the Master General and keep his fingers and lips from freezing in the chill wind. It had become a habit to glance at his mouthpiece each and every time he pulled it away, half expecting to see some bit of skin clinging to the metal. Damn Mars, anyway. Morey was awakened early to play reveille. Some days he felt as if he kissed his mouthpiece from sun-up to sundown. Other days he spent slumped in a chair, nodding off to sleep while he waited for Master General Campbell to be done with his strategy meetings. After supper, his time was his to do with what he wished, as long as he was on hand to play call to quarters, tattoo and taps. Occasionally, he was ordered to call the men to arms at odd hours to keep them on their toes, but he was usually given an early warning. At the end of most every day, he was allowed to join the civilized majority and sleep while the sun was down. Yes, the life of a bugler was fine indeed, and for the first time, well, ever, he was grateful for the sparsity of women about. He found his new skin to be comfortable, and he was in no hurry to test its fibre. As for the war itself, they saw no fighting through the autumn, though they were acutely aware of the Jacobite army moving south and gathering new recruits along the way, like so many eager chicks following after their mother hen. After Preston Pans, none dared stand in their way, but they were shadowed, and those shadows started wondering if perhaps God had invested James Stuart with divine right after all. By Christmas, it looked as if there would be a new king sitting on the throne in London. Chapter 8. On December 6th, Morey settled around a table with 3 other officers to take their minds off the cold by playing cards. He had just begun to win back his losses when a messenger arrived for the Master General. A mere minute later, Morey was ordered to call assembly, and by the time the troops were lined up properly, John Campbell was ready to share the news. "I was fully expecting a messenger," he said. "We believe the Jacobite army would reach London today. However," a smile bloomed across his face, "they have turned back." Argyle's army erupted, and having lost control of the celebrating men, Campbell turned and began shaking hands with the generals and officers. Morey watched closely for a signal to play again, but the man seemed in no hurry to end the festivity. Instead, he continued down a line of metal-laden chests until he came to his bugler. "Cheer up, Fraser. The war isn't over yet. In fact, it's just beginning. We're not quaking in our boots any longer, aye." Morey opened his mouth to deny that the day's news had been a disappointment, but Campbell gave him a look that said there was no need to lie. "When it is over," he continued, "I'll ease your way back to your clan, if that is what you wish, but there is something that can be said for staying where you're appreciated." He snapped Morey's shoulder and returned to the centre of the platform and lifted his arms. The assembly eventually quieted, and the men went back to attention. "Listen well. If the Jacobites are returning north, we shall be here to greet them. Make ready." It took 2 days of rushing about before the army seemed ready to face the enemy. It took an additional 10 for the enemy to arrive. In the interim, most of Cumberland's army had joined with Argyle's and met the Jacobites on Clifton Moor in Penrith. On December 18th, 1745, the victory belonged to the Jacobites, but not if the decision was based on where the dead were allowed to be buried. The Englishmen were buried in the Clifton kirkyard, while the Scots were buried beneath an oak tree. In January, the Jacobites tried to capture Stirling Castle but failed. Their momentum was interrupted, but only until they defeated General Henry Hawley's army at the Battle of Falkirk Muir. By February, they had captured Inverness and settled in for the rest of the winter. And while they settled in, the Duke of Cumberland trained his army, which included the Campbells, in the ways to defeat the Highlanders. And while they trained, Morey Fraser watched. Chapter 9. April 15th, 1746. There was something about the spring that drove a man to do many things, something elemental that made it impossible for him to sit idly by and wait for life to come to him. Instead, he was driven to seek it out, bend the earth to his will, bend others to his will. Morey expected it was the same with the Duke and the Prince, for they both seemed determined to prove they had divine rights of their own. No matter how hard Morey Fraser prayed against it, the entire armies of the Duke of Cumberland and the Jacobites were lining up for a momentous battle. But the Prince was unaware of how well the Duke had prepared his men. He didn't know that his enemy could fire 3 shots, if not more, to every one of the Jacobites. He didn't know that the government forces had been training to fight the Highland charge with a bayonet move that could not fail. No, Prince Charles Stuart didn't know, but Morey did, and that knowledge had been eating him alive for months. That vision had returned. In his mind he saw that long row of lasses looking out the gates of Beaufort Castle, but they didn't mourn the loss of a certain shepherd, neither did they spit in his wake. Rather, the same row of young ladies wept and collapsed in heartbreak over the loss of their Fraser men, the men Morey might have saved if he found the courage to turn coats and warn his kinsmen, and their prince what Cumberland's army had in store for them. Morey knew the Highland way as well as any of them. Move fast, strike fast, get away alive, then do it all again. If their leaders kenned that style of fighting would now work against them, they would surely disband, regroup, and retrain their men. If their leaders kenned, but no one would ken unless Morey turned coat. In spite of the wind coming off the North Sea, he sat on a boulder at the edge of camp at Nairn, looking southwest toward Inverness. The Jacobites had already moved and awaited just over 10 miles away. He could reach them before midnight, They could disperse before dawn. Cumberland and his men would march onto an empty field, all their training wasted. As had happened a dozen times that afternoon, Morey's arse launched off the rock, and he headed down the hill. 6 steps, 8, 12. This time he made it to 12 before his feet stopped. He growled at himself and about-faced trudged back up the hill and found a shiny boot resting on his rock. The boot was attached to a leg, attached to a uniform to shame all others. Morey gasped and saluted the Duke of Cumberland. Then he thought better of it and bowed. "Your name?" the Royal demanded. "Morey Fraser, your Majesty, bugler for—" "He's mine, your Grace." Morey felt his head flush. The Master General had witnessed his bumbling conversation with one of England's princes. "Not for long, Campbell. He means to desert. I am surprised you would trust a Fraser." To Morey he said, "You should have claimed to be a Campbell." "Your Grace, I must insist you cease teasing the lad." Campbell came to stand between them. "Fraser is unfeelingly loyal to me. He would never desert." The Duke snorted. "I have watched him head down the hill twice in less than 15 minutes. I tell you, he means to desert. I want him arrested before he gives the game away." Morey dared not make a sound. He would not struggle and claim his innocence all the way to the hangman. He only regretted he hadn't had the courage to follow through and warn the Jacobites. Campbell seemed as calm as the night he'd ordered Cooper to hang. "I beg your pardon, your Grace, but the lad is still here, is he not?" Cumberland's eyes narrowed. He didn't appreciate being questioned clearly. "You would risk your very life by defending him, trusting him." "I would wager my life on his loyalty, yes." The Master General was sober as a monk. Cumberland inclined his head. "A wager, then. If he deserts, I shall arrest you instead." Campbell bowed slightly. "So be it. But when he proves faithful, what will be my boon?" The Duke's eyes narrowed again. If the other man weren't careful, he'd swing with Morey before morning. "You'll both be allowed to live. I assume that is agreeable." Campbell hid his irritation, but only just. "You're too generous, your Grace." Cumberland pouted like an ill-mannered child. "I've been generous enough, considering it's my birthday." And with that he pulled his boot from the rock and turned for camp, leaving Morey alone with Campbell, who had to know his bugler had tried to betray him. "Come, Fraser, let us get you away from this hill so his Grace can relax." Morey's feet were stuck in place. He couldn't do it. He shook his head. "Nay, sir, you must ken the Duke had it aright." His heart was beating against his ribs, hard enough to break them. The memory returned of shiny boots twitching in the torchlight. This was war. There was no need for a trial. He might be hanged immediately. They were talking about treason, plain and simple, and Morey had confessed to it. Campbell sighed. His mouth pinched. "Tell me, lad, how many times have you gone down the hill?" "Today, sir, dozens." The man nodded, considering. "And how many times did you come back?" "The same, but still." "It's human nature," Campbell said. "We tend to stay where we are appreciated. Now come." He turned his back and strode away, as if he had complete faith that Morey would follow. For a long moment, Morey was furious that anyone would presume to know just what he would do. Didn't the man realise that he was still a Fraser, that somewhere to the southwest there were hundreds of Frasers who would soon die if he didn't warn them away? How dare he imagine his bugler would put loyalty to him above loyalty to clan? But another vision crowded into his seething mind. Once again, Morey knelt and placed his head upon a block, but instead of Prince Charles demanding he be executed for treason, it was Cumberland standing with one boot on the seat of his throne, gesturing for the executioner to get on with it. And instead of Lord Lovat coming to his rescue, taking the blame for sending him to aid the enemy, it was Master General John Campbell offering to take Morey's place. A wager, then. Campbell would pay with his reputation, at the very least, if Morey ran. The man had risked his life already to keep his bugler from being arrested. Had the man not found him speaking with Cumberland, Morey might already be hanging from some tree. How lucky he'd been. He already owed John Campbell his life. His gaze retraced the direction from which the Master General had come. Because of a great gouge in the earth the size of a large wagon and a thick copse of trees along one end, there was only one place the man could have come from, a shaded plateau from which Campbell must have been watching. But for how long? How many times had he witnessed Morey start down the hill, stop and march back up? It could have been chance that brought the man to so awkward a place. Either he'd been in hiding for a bit of peace and quiet, or he'd followed Morey and stayed to spy. Had he watched for an hour, he would know how tortured his bugler was, and how likely he might be to warn the rebels. And yet the man had risked everything to trust him. "Damn you, John Campbell, I never wanted to like ye." But he did. And now he owed the Master General his life. How could he possibly leave now? How unequal were the lives of men when set against another life on a scale. On one side, John Campbell and Morey Fraser. On the other hand, hundreds of men who might be warned away. Aye, might, a weighty word, that. But what if none of the rebels chose to believe the warning when it came from the enemy's bugler? What if both his and Campbell's lives were forfeited for naught? Morey stared down the slope and imagined himself running, but his leader was right. He'd only come back again. So, dejected, he followed after the Master General, understanding that, if he were ever able to return to Beaufort Castle, he would have to beg forgiveness from more than just the lasses. Chapter 10. April 16th, 1746. The next morning, Mars was proven to be a poor predictor of the future, for Morey found himself stationed on Drumossie Moor, near Culloden House, directly across from an impressive collection of Frasers. In fact, the colours of the plaid were so familiar, he squinted his eyes to see if he might recognise himself amongst their number. The distance made it impossible to tell, but if he wasn't mistaken, his cousin, Swain, was there. Of course, it might have only been Morey's imagination. In fact, he found half a dozen tall forms that might be his cousin. He wished he had better eyesight. But after a glance back and forth comparing the readiness of both armies, the well-rested redcoats versus the seemingly weary Jacobites, he thanked God that he could not see clearer. In truth, if it wouldn't prove foolish, he would like very much to stand in one place and keep his eyes closed until the battle was over. That way he wouldn't have to witness the loss of so many lives that might have been saved if he had been a braver man. As he waited for the nightmare to begin, word travelled to his company that Cumberland had ordered no quarter. No mercy would be offered, no prisoners taken, no life spared. Upon hearing it, Morey searched the distance for the Duke and found the mounted prince faced his way. Of course the royal wouldn't be looking for him, but Morey hoped mercy hadn't been removed from the offer simply to punish him for his attempt to desert. Please, God, if Swain is to die, take me instead. Dinna let my cousin pay the price of my inaction. A burst of wind brushed past him with such force it made him turn back to face the battlefield to keep the air from rushing up his nose. Perhaps it was God, he thought, accepting his request, or perhaps it was only a warning that the wind might be toying with his bugle calls. Again he noted the flagging of the enemy, shoulders slumped behind drooping targes, weapons pointed at the ground as if all energy would be saved for the moment of attack. These cannot be the men who fought at Preston Pans. They look as if they've walked to London and back in the past few days alone. Neither side can show pity, Campbell was telling his men. If every man does his best, God can decide who wins the day. Just pray he chooses us. Morey nodded to himself. Prayer was the only thing left to him, but he had to pray quickly, for he would soon be focused on the orders he was given, on the calls he needed to play. He could be as blind to the rest of it as the battle would allow. Hopefully, if the fighting never reached too deep into the Campbell ranks, he wouldn't have to watch anyone die. As he'd been taught by his mother, he prayed for his enemy, though God only knew who that was anymore. He prayed for kin, for Frasers, for Highlanders, for Scotland. At the end, he simply prayed it would end quickly, the victor crowned with as little bloodshed as possible. A blast from the Jacobites caught him off guard. He fumbled with his bugle, brought it to his lips, but the order didn't come. He glanced at Campbell, consulting with two of his officers. They weren't ready yet, and then they were. The firing of the cannons began like a symphony, an overture, an introduction. This, Jacobites, it said, is how it begins. But the Jacobites didn't answer. Though the pounding of the guns dominated the scene, the sounds that demanded Morey's attention were the shouts of the Jacobite soldiers. Confusion, fervour, then anger. Morey didn't have to see through the billowing smoke to know that they weren't fighting back. He couldn't resist watching the Frasers. Weary no longer, they were poised, raring to be loosed upon the world, but some invisible force held them back, and while they held, they were picked off one at a time, maybe 3 at a go. A cannonball propelled one man back through 4 or 5 others. They were being slaughtered. To the left, some rebels broke ranks and ran full out. To the right, there was fighting amongst themselves. Colours of plaid shifted. A new group pushed to the fore and ran full out. These had to be the men from Preston Pans. This was enough to make an enemy flee, but they got mired in the muddy bog. Swords and targes lowered by men who now had to fight the Moor itself. And while they fought the Moor, the cannons fired. Cumberland's men moved forward with blades raised to cut down an enemy already caught. Campbell gave the order. His fusiliers were to fire. Morey was expected to sound the call. "Do it!" The hiss came from Mars. He was already beating on his drum, glaring at him suspicious. The exchange took 3 seconds, a heartbeat of hesitation that was just enough to soothe his soul. Because of him, his cousins' hearts would beat once or twice more than they might have. "Live, swine! Live, damn you!" Morey brought his bugle to his lips. He blew the call. Another order. Another call. He couldn't stomach watching any more, but he would do his duty. After all, his actions meant nothing now. He should have tried to stop the madness before it began. May God forgive him. He'd put the honour of one man above the lives of his clan. With blood now flowing, the bodies on the scales seemed quite equal to him now. A cannon sounded from across the battlefield, then another. The Jacobites roared and charged toward the bog. It might have been impressive had so many not already fallen. As it was, the ragtag army was already defeated. Despite their speed, more were caught in the mud. Some stepped on their fallen comrades to cross it, but now at least they were able to fight back. Morey was so relieved for the Highlander's sakes he forgot to worry about himself. The fight was coming to him. Campbell gave the order to advance. Morey began the call, but his bugle was knocked out of his grasp with a clang, and he quickly turned to look for it. Blood spit out of the back of a captain's neck, splattering across the left side of Morey's face. No time to wipe it away. Must find my bugle. Grandfather's bugle. He searched frantically, as if the instrument were his only weapon, his only defence against the oncoming enemy. The enemy? No. Death was the enemy, no matter the hands bent on delivering it. There, under a leg, something shined up at him, but a pain stopped him from reaching. So frustrating to be shot while trying to free one's bugle. The bullet bit into his left arm. A dark, rapidly growing circle of blood engulfed the bright yellow cords on his shoulder. Something snapped against his head. He fell straight back to the ground as if he had no legs at all. May God help any man who found his bugle before he did. Chapter 11. When Morey awoke, the sounds of the battle had ceased for the most part. Guns still fired, but randomly. It had been obvious whom God had chosen to be the victor, and Morey's prayer for a bloodless resolution had gone unanswered. His horn. He remembered seeing it under a leg. It couldn't be far, but, alas, he couldn't seem to move. So tired. He woke to a pain and groaning, and found that the groaning came not from him. There were voices, two men chatting away as if they didn't hear the wounded man. Someone grunted. The groaning ceased. The cause was no mystery. Cumberland's men were murdering the wounded. Morey was wounded. Ah, but luckily he was wearing the enemy's uniform. "How many of them?" asked one man. 17, replied the other. In the ensuing silence came a hail of gunfire, distant but not so far away that he couldn't hear the bodies fall to the ground. No quarter indeed. The two soldiers chatted again, moving nearer. "This one's still bleeding. Hold, there, you see, he's one of ours. A goner for certain." The joke was on them. He wasn't a goner, and he wasn't a Hanoverian either. When Morey awoke yet again, it was to full-on darkness, but the darkness moved and startled him. He didn't think he'd made a sound, but the blackest shadow turned and lowered its hood. If it was death, death was a young lass with tears in her eyes. "Please," he whispered, "help me." The lass seemed surprised. "Morey, is it you?" The agony of his head wound prevented him from thinking clearly. "Do I ken you, lassie? Forgive me if I dinna remember your name, and forgive me for any dishonour." "You've no reason to remember me," she said in a rush, "so ease your mind." She squatted beside him, noted the wound on the right of his head, and smiled through the tears she'd already been shedding. "I am right sorry for it, Morey, but there is naught I can do." "There is." He winced at the hot knife of pain that sliced through his noggin for raising his voice. "I cannot seem to move, but I only wish to have my bugle placed in my hand. It would be a comfort." She nodded, stood, and searched the ground. After a moment, she reached and straightened with his grandfather's bugle clasped in her hand like a great prize. Triumph. She returned him and fumbled with his arm. Disappointment filled his eyes with tears. "I cannae feel it." "Sure you can, Morey Fraser. You feel the cold of it, aye." "Aye, the cold. I can feel the cold." "That's your bugle, laddie, all but frozen to your hand. You'll not lose it now." Relieved that he'd kept track of his grandsire's bugle as he promised to do, He relaxed. "You're wearing the government uniform, laddie. I don't suppose you'd like me to remove it." "Look, aye, it gives me no warmth. 'Tis a fact it chills me to the soul to have it on me, aye." He felt her yank here and there as she tugged the coat from his shoulders, then pulled it out from under him and took it away. When she returned, she tucked the length of wool beneath him and pulled the ends over his chest. "Now," she said, "I'll leave you with a wish then, shall I?" "A wish? Are ye a witch?" "Aye, I'm just that." She leaned down and placed a kiss on his forehead. "I felt that," he said. "Truly I did." She grinned. "Warm, I hope." "Aye, warm indeed." "Well, laddie, that's your wish you're feeling. When you're ready to make it, close your eyes and think it clearly. Do you ken?" He tried to understand. "I'm to make a wish?" "Aye, when you're ready." Another dark figure came up behind her, and Morey tried to cry out, but a hard hammer of pain stole his breath away. The lass glanced over her shoulder, then back at him. "Easy now, he's with me." She gave him a sad smile. "And I shall see you anon." When next he opened his eyes, the lass was gone, and the sky was made darker still by a thick blanket of clouds that blocked the road to heaven. While he waited for the way to open again, he fell asleep and tried to dream of dark angels who promised to grant wishes. But alas, all he dreamt of was pain. In the wee hours of dawn, Morey woke to the sound of voices. He recognised the brogue of true Highlanders. It was music to his ears. A young lad shouted excitedly, calling out numbers. Chapter 12. "Look how far this bloke made it." Morey struggled to open his eyes, but he was certain whoever spoke above him was English. He could still hear that lad shouting out numbers and wondered why the murmurs of so many Highlanders continued as well. Did they not fear Cumberland's vengeance? They might have been prisoners, he supposed, but the Duke had ordered no prisoners be taken, hadn't they? Exerting all the energy that remained in his body, Morey tried again to open his eyes. A slit of blue sky appeared, then a soldier's face. "He lives yet, still bleeding, and I recognise him. One of ours, though he is out of uniform. One of the rebels must have stolen it." The soldier squatted and looked into Morey's eyes. "Easy now," he said. "You're not long for this life, Bugler, but we promise not to bury you alive. We will come back for you, later." "It might be a kindness to hurry it along, do you suppose?" asked another. "Pinch his nose, cover his mouth. He might wish the pain to end." The first gave his head a firm shake, then smiled at Morey. "Make your peace with God, Bugler. We shall return." He stood and moved away, but came back a moment later to tuck something beneath Morey's head before disappearing again. With his view changed, Morey could see a bit of the moor. Small companies of redcoats worked along one edge, separating bodies into piles of like-coloured plaid, but the Highlanders were nowhere in sight, though we could still hear the lad cry out a number now and then, with bits of conversation in between. Morey couldn't turn to see if they were behind him, but it made no matter. Their voices were clearly coming from the battlefield beyond his feet. "Where are ye?" he wanted to call, but he had already accepted the fact that his life was done. With just a glance, the one soldier had confirmed as much. "That'll be 72 then." The lad seemed quite excited. He couldn't have been more than a dozen steps away, and yet there was no movement between Morey's white spats and the redcoats. He so desperately wanted to see them, to know that some of his kind had survived the slaughter. Would that God could allow him that. Though all sense of cold had left him, there was a sudden warmth on his forehead, and away to the right of centre, where the lass had placed her lips. Of all the kisses he'd won in his short life, it had been the only one freely given. He hadn't cajoled it from her. There had been no pretence involved. But she hadn't called it a kiss, she'd called it a wish. When you're ready to make it, close your eyes and think it clearly. Morey hoped his mind wasn't toying with him, hoped the memory of the lass was real, that the kiss was not just a bit of fancy, though the part about the wish must have been just that. And yet, what else did a lad do while he listened to his own dying breath in his breast? For good measure he prayed to God, as he'd been taught to do, on behalf of those Highlanders still living. Hopefully his prayer could carry through the patches of blue still visible between gathering clouds of grey. Next he closed his eyes as he'd been instructed, though he feared he might never open them again, and hoped God would forgive him for testing the lass's promise. He was ready to form his wish, but his chest was suddenly heavy, crushingly so. He had to struggle to take in air. His lungs wanted to be done. He gasped and grasped at his thoughts as they began to slip from him toward the waters of a long black loch. It was too late for wishing. No time left. He might have wished to go back again, to have found a way to serve those Highlanders, to spur them. A great yawn overtook Morey, and he shuddered. He'd witnessed death rattles before, but he was surprised to still be alert when the time came for his own soul to shake off his bones. And suddenly it was over. The crushing weight was gone, along with the need for air. Without thought he sat up, then stood. His body lay on the ground before him. A muddy Jacobite flag peeked out from where it had been stuffed behind his head. His right temple was dark with a combination of fresh and drying blood. His other wound had removed all trace of yellow on the left shoulder. The cords on his right were still cheery, still clean, ready for an outing. The wool blanket tucked around his middle and covering his chest had no pattern. Other than the white spats over his boots, there was no sign he'd fought for Cumberland. If the one soldier hadn't recognised him, might he have been buried alive? He shuddered, turned away, and found a light moving near, brighter than the gloomy morning, with no one carrying it. In the span of a heartbeat, the light became a spacious walkway, a tunnel with a single figure standing to the fore. "Grandsire!" Morey reached out to the man who had taught him every call, had drilled each note into his memory. Though the older man smiled and opened his arms in welcome, Morey had an overwhelming need to do something first, before leaving the world of the living. He just didn't know what that something was. He turned to look at his body once again. The beloved bugle lay there. Was he to take it with him? Morey bent to see if he could retrieve it. The instrument came away easily, but now there were two, the one he held, and the one still clutched in his inert hands. He turned back to his grandsire. "Choose," the man said. Morey didn't understand. "Choose which bugle?" Grandsire shook his head. "Will you come with me, or will you stay with them?" He pointed out to the battlefield. Morey followed his gesture and found dozens of Highlanders standing defiantly around the Moor. They all looked to a young laddie and his dog as they hurried about. 78, the lad pointed, then sprinted in the opposite direction toward a man who was pulling himself out of the mud. "Your name, sir?" "Murray," said the muddy one. "Is this hill, then?" "Nay, sir," the lad laughed. "'Tis Culloden, and ye're the 78th to rise. I'm Rabbi MacDonald. I was number 8. This is Dauphin." He gestured to his dog. Murray appeared to be more confused than ever. He murmured to the Highlander standing nearest him, but that one shrugged and shook his head. Morey watched the redcoats wandering like armies of ants around the field, but none noticed the rebels gathering above the mud. Above the mud! The Highlander stood on the bog as if it were made of rock, where they should have been struggling to free their feet. Their boots fairly skimmed the ground. They were spirits in truth, spirits like him. The Lord's back of a Jacobite rose to the east, out of the jumble of bodies that had fought and fallen before Munro's brigade. These were the men who hadn't been hindered by the bog, who had been able to reach the Hanoverians and engage in true battle. But in a clash of swords, it was hard to believe this braw blonde hadn't won the day. But of course there'd been no quarter given. 79! The lad hurried over to the brute. There are 79 of us now, the boy explained. Your name, sir? The man stood silent, noted the redcoats and the Highlanders, then looked down at the carnage from whence he'd risen. After a long moment, he noticed the lad again. Captain Simon McLaren. The boy introduced himself and his dog, just as he had before, and after he laughed about being invisible to the red dogs, he fell silent again. And together they all waited for the next man to rise, but none did. No matter how long they waited, not another spirit rose to join them, and eventually Morey hoped it was his time to be acknowledged, so he lifted his arm and waved at the lad. Only the lad didn't notice. None of them noticed. Morey waved with both arms, and still none of them turned his way, and an emotion he hadn't felt for years rolled through him like a rogue sea wave. He'd been left out. There would be no number for the ghost of an enemy, no matter how repentant. If he could have shed a tear, he would have, then and there, and in shame he turned away to find his grandsire still awaiting his decision. The urge to flee, the urge to pretend none of it had ever happened, almost got the better of him. Almost. His grandsire lowered his brow. You're staying, then? Morey realised he'd already decided. He'd taken a step or two away from the welcoming arms of his kin. I will stay, he said, hoping a cheery smile might help him soften any insult his grandsire might feel. I will stay until the last Highlander has found peace, and I have earned the right to be numbered among them. Come back for me then, aye. Grandsire nodded, winked, and was gone, along with the bright light. Morey only hoped he hadn't made a serious miscalculation. Chapter 13. Nothing can unnerve a man like flocks of carrion birds haunting a battleground while he stands beside his own lifeless body. As Morey Fraser watched, a pair of red kites broke off from their brothers and winged his way. The flailing of his arms affected them not at all. They landed a yard from his pillowed head and cocked theirs. The only weapon to hand was his bugle. It was the instinct to protect his open, staring eyes that brought the instrument to his lips, and he blew. The notes were full and clear, though they didn't seem to carry far, as if a great wall had been constructed around the battlefield to throw his call back to him. But no matter how unearthly his lips and breath and the blast of his horn, the birds startled and flew away. Where are those soldiers? They must hasten back. No matter if it means I will be buried with Cumberland's men. At least the birds shall not get me if I am safely below ground. He turned, still searching for the grave detail, and found the 79 Highlanders staring directly at him. They'd heard his horn. Though the living went on marching around them, the spirits had heard grandsire's bugle. Like another rogue wave, he was nearly knocked off his feet by a groundswell of emotion, only this time it wasn't his own. The spirits spoke not a word, but nevertheless all seemed to call out to him with one simple entreaty, 79-fold. Help me make sense of this madness. His duty in life had been to help soldiers and leaders communicate. He supposed it was natural for them to look for some signal from him to know what they were expected to do. But how could he know? How could he assume to guess what God had in store for these brave, ill-fated men? He suddenly recalled the wish he ought to have made, to have helped the Highlanders in some way. So perhaps it was the reason he'd been allowed to stay. If he hadn't helped the living, maybe he could help the dead. Madness, chaos, horror, confusion. He could at least bring them some sense of order. He played assembly. Though they might have been more attuned to the call of the pipes, there seemed to be no piper among them, so a bugle call would have to do, and it did. The ghosts from the farthest reaches of the Moor hurried to gather with the others. Allowing them time to work out their order required repeating the call 4 times, but eventually they all settled into a tidy arrangement with the wee laddie and his dog on the front row. The last man, the imposing blonde, stepped out of line and shouted, "Count your heads and how you water." He stepped smartly back to his position in the ranks. "Man, 2, 3. They went down the line. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the lad said proudly. Then his dog barked as if he too had a number to call, and they all chuckled. 9, 10. And so it went until the big man shouted, 79. For a long while they simply stood in formation, looking back and forth at the men to either side of them. Some grinned, some nodded. A new emotion, a fragile contentment, emanated from the lot of them until at last Captain McLaren stepped out again. He nodded once to Morey, as if to thank him, then shouted, "Dismissed!" Curious to see where they might go, Morey watched as the ghosts dispersed. Some wandered over to the line of massive graves being dug. A few tried to get the attention of a group of redcoats playing a game on the ground. Dice, perhaps. Many moved about looking at the faces of the dead, but most disturbing were those who returned to the location on the moor where they might have fallen for the last time. And regardless of whether or not their cold bodies remained in those positions, or if they'd been carried away for burial, their spirits slipped back into place. Face down in the mud, lying on their backs with limbs twisted beneath them, none of it seemed to matter. Those who hadn't been distracted by the living or the dead returned to their death masks like weary workers returning to their comfortable beds. Morey couldn't fathom it until he felt the call himself. He turned back to his body only to find that it was gone. Whether or not the red kites had collected his eyes, he would never know, nor did it matter. He simply called back to the spot where the last drops of his blood had spilled. He knelt, sat, then relaxed back into the arms of the mossy Moor, welcomed home after discharging his duty, content to rest until he was needed again. Each time following, when Morey Fraser was called from his bed, it was the plea of a single spirit that awakened him. Culloden's 79, they styled themselves, and to a man each of them called for the bugler at one time or another, feeling a need to know that they were not alone on the moor. They found solace in shouting out their numbers and discovering that, through the years, none of the others had abandoned them. Brothers in battle, brothers in death, brothers after death. And though Morey witnessed the world changing along with the rest of them, he did not move among them. Always he deemed himself unworthy and hoped that some day he might feel otherwise, that some day the 79 might come to believe he had earned his place among them. He was always quick to answer the silent call of a troubled Highlander, and, like them, he listened closely as each number was called out. But among the 79, nothing ever changed until one spring. Chapter 14. After serving as their bugler for 269 years, someone was missing, and not just one someone. It had begun as any other plea for reassurance. After sensing the need, Morey roused immediately and called assembly. He sensed a change in the tone of the Highlanders' numbers as they were shouted. There was anticipation, a nervousness he didn't understand until Robbie, the lad, failed to give his number. Neither did Dauphin give a bark. Morey searched the front row, but they were gone. After a pause, the counting resumed. 9, 10. Number 13 was skipped over. Number 14 was there, but more solemn than usual. Number 17 was followed by 19, with hardly a heartbeat between. By the time it was done, Morey believed 3 more numbers had been omitted. 26, 33 and 64. 6 missing, then. Though Captain McLaren had dismissed them, the Highlanders lingered. Morey was grateful, for he had no intention of resting until he found out where the others had gone. For if one could leave, they all could leave, and he might be left standing on Culloden Moor with no one left to grant him absolution. Captain! He'd never presumed to speak to any of them directly, let alone their leader. But McLaren ignored him and moved back to his preferred station, keeping watch from atop the Cameron monument. He had been on the field 1 second, and the next he was off to the south, striking his usual broody pose. Morey turned to the Highlander about to pass him by. Sir, number 25, isn't it? The fellow paused. Aye, Finlay Smith, an it please ye. Praise be, Morey replied. I'm worried that none of ye can hear me. The man shrugged. Tell me, I beg ye, where have they gone, Robbie and the others? Well, none of us kens, do we? Finlay rubbed the stubble on his chin. I suppose you weren't called up with the rest of us that night. He frowned for a moment. You see, our wee witch came on summer solstice and said that we'd be moving on to God's judgment, ready or not. She's been sending us away, one at a time, to perform a noble deed of some sort, to earn our revenge on Charles Edward Stuart before we move on to face God. His eyes lit with excitement. I hope to kill me a dragon, aye, or one of those dinosaur beasts I've brought back from extinction. He grinned. Won't the bonny prince shite himself if I came at him with a monster's head over my own? Finlay barked with laughter and turned away. No entreaty could bring him back. Morey stopped another. Beg pardon, please, 73, can you tell me more of this witch who's taken the laddie and his dog? Lumsden, the man said, then frowned. Tulloch Lumsden, if I remember aright. Morey inclined his head. Morey Fraser, sir. The man's frown pinched tighter. Fraser. He glanced north toward the position of the Royal Fusiliers, where Morey had fallen. Siding with the Hanovers. His brow lowered like the horns of a bull, preparing to charge. Even though Morey could have easily blamed Lord Lovat and spared himself some of Lumsden's ire, he couldn't do it. It was his own fault he'd remained with Campbell, and now that the time was at hand, he had to admit that he'd stayed to save himself. To turn coats would have put him on the side of those who were doomed from the start. Finally, he nodded to the Highlander. I fought on the wrong side. Lumsden shook his head. Nay, Fraser, you fought on the side of the wrong. Then he turned away. Morey nodded again. The man was correct, and perhaps instead of looking for forgiveness for nearly 3 centuries, he should have been looking inside himself for the truth of it. Once he'd imagined the ghosts of the Glencoe MacDonalds warning him to flee from the Campbell's hearth. Now he knew, illusory or not, he should have listened. "Yes, I fought on the side of the wrong," he called to the fearing figure of the Highlander. "And it is my fervent wish ye can forgive me for it, all of ye." The last was little more than a whisper, but suddenly all the spirits turned to face him. McLaren strode forward from the Cameron monument, his strides eating up the moor in great gulps as he bore down on him. It might have been wise to flee back to the red flags that marked the government line, but hadn't he proved time and again he wasn't prone to wisdom? The large captain stopped a mere 2 feet from him and narrowed his gaze. "Your name?" "Morey Fraser of the Boll of Meal, Frasers." "And ye did knowingly fight alongside the Campbells?" "Aye, sir, to my great shame and regret." "And ye wish for absolution?" "I do. I wish—" Had he ever used his wish from the witch? It was impossible to remember. Besides, he couldn't be certain if she had been a figment of his imagination alone. However, even if he had the power to demand his own absolution, he wouldn't use it. Long ago, among the Duke of Argyle's Campbells, he'd learned from Cooper how hollow life could be if he compelled others to bend to his will. He'd not be so foolish now. He searched the faces that surrounded him. "I hope the lot of ye can forgive me." McLaren searched those faces as well. Then he lifted his arms. "All in favour of forgiving the bugler, say aye." "Aye!" The shout was like a cannon blast that fairly shook the ground. Though Morey received many a sober nod, there were plenty of smiles aimed his way as well. "Will you believe in us, then?" McLaren wanted to know. Though Morey looked forward to the day his grandsire would come for him again, he had no intention of recanting his pledge. "Nay," he said, for all to hear. "I once vowed that I would not leave Culloden until all of the 79 have found their peace. I will keep my vow." McLaren gave him an approving nod, followed by a disapproving one, when Morey asked about Finlay Smith's witch. With only a grunt for an answer, the big man stomped away. But Cameron, the storyteller, was eager to oblige. It was with a happy heart that Morey learned the witch who had made miraculous promises to the 79, and indeed managed to remove 6 spirits from the Moor already, bore a striking resemblance to the witch that had promised him a wish, and he suspected, by the slight burning sensation on his forehead a bit right of centre, he still had yet to spend it. Chapter 15. The gloaming found Morey Fraser standing near the red flag that marked the Royal Fusilier's position at the beginning of the Battle of Culloden. The breeze off the North Sea had long since been replaced by the steady creep of a fog that marched onto the moor like a new army, the leader of which was a bold, thick cloud that stuck out to the fore like the front tire of a motorcycle. When it slowed and stopped near Morey, he half expected the devil himself to emerge. Still, he started when he saw the swirl of a black cape step from the dense mist. He relaxed at the sight of a familiar face. "Hello again, witch." Her grin was bright and cheery. "Hello, Morey Fraser." "I don't suppose you're the same witch that has been stealing away my Highlanders." She looked him up and down. "Your Highlanders? Och, aren't ye a bold one? I say they're as much mine as my own soul." He snorted. "But I've served them from the beginning." She nodded in agreement. "And glad they've been to have ye." He knew it, but it gave him great satisfaction to hear it from another. So, have you come to take another, or are you here to grant that wish? She feigned surprise, then grinned. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten the gift. Morey shrugged a shoulder. I will admit that I've only lately come to believe in its power. I see, and I will admit I expected ye to have collected it sooner. It has been a long while since I gifted it, aye. Aye, I was thinking just the same. Nearly 300 years it's been, which means that ye, my good witch, stood right here on this very ground that long ago. I don't suppose you'd care to explain that to me. She threw her head back and laughed, then gave him a shrewd wink. Not unless ye wish to know. Oh, nay. He shook his head briskly. I'll not waste it. I only wondered. She pursed her lips for a moment, then nodded. It will hurt nothing to tell you, then, that I have a great uncle who has a way with time. He can move across the years as if there were nothing more than planks on a path, and betimes he can take another along. What were you doing on the moor that night, eh? Sprinkling your fairy dust on the dead, so they'd rise up later to be your playthings. She winced. Her eyes were instantly moist, and Morey was instantly contrite. Forgive me, lass. I've seen too much cinema, I suppose, and one of those fairy tales came to mind. She turned her back to him. Forgiven, she said cheerfully, though he could hear the tears muffling her voice. When she faced him once more, her eyes were dry and her smile was back, though a bit dimmer than before. So, what's it to be? I must warn you, however, that I cannot give you your life again as I've done for the others. Had he been a living man, he would have blanched at the news. You give them life? Aye, but only 2 days. 'Twas a bargain I struck, but only for the 79. I've no extras, ye understand. He shook his head. I never expected any such thing. In truth, I never believed you had the power to grant a wish, but now I'm certain I can think of something. They both stared out across the moor for a while, watching the rest of the mist wander where it would. And while they watched, Morey wondered what he most wanted. To see his father once again. To ask the man why he walked away from his clan and his son without so much as a fare thee well. Had his new wife insisted? Had some accident befallen them before he could send word, or send for Morey to join them elsewhere? He'd spent far too much time wondering, and had decided to let the past lie. Why waste a precious wish on it? What did they say? Dinna throw good money after bad. Perhaps he should ask to know what became of Swain and the other Frasers, whom Lord Lovat had sent along with his son to fight for Charlie. Did Morey want to know, or would it only sadden him? Did he want forgiveness from all the lassies he'd plied with sweet talk? While he'd waited for his bugling to prove his value to the clan, he'd gathered trophies of kisses stolen and hearts won, measuring his success against Swain's and others. He'd been such a fool, a young fool. But he was no longer that lad, so he wouldn't waste his wish on apologies that no longer applied to him. He looked deep into his own heart and tried to be as honest with himself as he'd been with the Highlanders when he'd admitted to fighting for Cumberland. What do I want? What would I ha' wished for had I been living? Of course he knew. What do you long for, Morey Fraser? Speak it aloud. The young witch paced in circles around him, waiting, waiting. Those large dark eyes flashed to his. What is it you want, Bugler, more than anything? Love, he blurted, then dipped his head, embarrassed. Are you happy? I wish to be loved and perhaps love in return. To feel it, to know it, to never wonder. If you were capable of it. He shook his head and looked into her fathomless eyes, baring his soul to her in the doing. To know if I was unlovable. The witch's lower lip quivered once before she grabbed his ghostly head and pulled it down to her, a feat he couldn't imagine possible. But he felt her lips on his skin again, slightly right of centre, as she'd done so long ago. He didn't want her pity, but before he could tell her, it was over. "Done," she said, her breath whispering across his skin, as no breeze, no wind had been able to do for centuries. "You've spent your wish, Morey, only you must give me a day or two to see to things." "Och, lassie, what's a day or two to me?" Chapter 16. Sonny got off the train at Waverley Station and made the short trek over the bridge and up the Royal Mile to Cockburn Street. She'd come to her great-aunt's tea shop for help many times already, and the pair wouldn't mind helping her again. Only this time they might not like her request or her reason for asking. Her feet knew the way, and as she came around the curve, the sight of the teacups and saucers hanging in the window was an unconscious signal to relax. It was like coming home. She reached for the door and smiled at the message painted there. "Rent a cup, the tea is free." The clank of the bell sounded overhead as she pushed the door open. She closed it quietly and stood still to test the beloved proprietors. "Don't be clever, Sonny dear." The voice came from beyond the thick curtains that separated the tea-room from the foyer. "Come in, come in." Sonny parted the velvet and entered the inner sanctum. Lorraine and Loretta, a matching pair who looked just half their age of 80-something, sat at the back table on the left side, closest to the kitchen. 3 mismatched teacups waited along with a silver kettle and service on a platter. Lorraine touched the side of the pot, then shook her hand. "Kettle's hot. Shall I pour?" Sonny nodded, slid her pack off her shoulder and onto the floor beside the wall, unwound her scarf and laid it on top. "We don't like it when we can't read your thoughts," Loretta said with a frown. Sonny scoffed and pointed to the 3rd cup. "You knew I was coming." The woman shook her head. "Not the same at all. Well, it wouldn't kill you to be surprised every once in a while. You might even like it." "Not bloody likely," Loretta said in her best pirate impression. Having lived a long time in the States, her aunt's Scottish accents came and went, much like their age seemed to do. Sometimes they appeared old and weary, other times after a visit from Wickham they seemed young and lively again, and given his mastery of time itself, she suspected her great-uncle had given his sisters an unworldly facelift or two. Sonny had made the comment once that Wickham and his wife didn't look 30 years old, when she knew her great-uncle had to be in his 70s. Then she'd asked Loretta flat out if he had found a way to take off the years. "You have it backward," her aunt replied. "Wickham never aged in the first place." Sitting in the tea-room, summoning her courage, Sonny looked up to find Lorraine staring at her over the rim of her cup. She tried not to feel offensive, but only a fool would let their guard down with her great aunts in the room. At least Sonny was their own, however, and knew they'd put her protection above all else. So although she was curious, she had nothing to worry over, unless they decided not to help her this time. "She thinks we might not help her," Lorraine told her sister, as if Sonny wasn't sitting right there between them. "Maybe it's dangerous," Loretta said. She widened her eyes, then giggled. The Muir sisters, with their strong powers of precognition, had little to worry over as well. There was no sense beating around the bush. Others were waiting on her after all, so Sonny got to the point. "I need to speak to the dead." Loretta narrowed her eyes. And I must speak with Simon the Fox." She said the name quickly, as if it had power to coil around and sink its fangs into her, which, knowing how her great aunts felt about the man, was understandable. In the 18th century, Simon Fraser had hanged one or two Muir sisters as a witch. The other sister had taken her own life. Sonny's aunts shared a look that might have made other folks nervous, but it gave Sonny hope. They weren't repulsed by the idea of calling up Simon the Fox. They were excited by it. "We'll need others to hold him tight," said Loretta. Lorraine grinned. "To force him to cooperate. What about Gillian and Jules?" Lorraine shook her head. "One or the both of them is always pregnant." The other aunt pursed her lips. "What is the name of this ghostie? I thought there was only one Fraser among them, and he's already been removed." Sonny bit her lip and heaved the sigh of a weary old woman, hoping it might soften the ladies up a bit. Lorraine cocked her head. "Confess." "Fine." Sonny tried to remember just how she'd rehearsed it on the train. "His name is Morey Fraser, a bugler. Lord Lovat sent him to the Duke of Argyll." Both sisters jumped to their feet. The scrape of their chairs on the plaid carpet cut off the rest of what she'd planned to say. Loretta pointed a finger in her face. "You promised. Give your word." Lorraine rolled her eyes, then closed them. "That all 79 were Jacobites. You swore you wouldn't ask for more, and now you want to sacrifice. But there's nothing left to sacrifice." Sonny's head sunk between her hands with every word, and offered a quiet excuse. "The 79 have forgiven him." Someone grunted above her head. "What difference does that make?" She looked up to find both aunts waiting with hands on hips. Everything they'd said was true. She really couldn't argue, but she had to. For Morey, who stood by for 3 centuries, just in case he was needed. She dared smile a little. "Because, aunties, if they can forgive him for being on the wrong side of the war, then everyone else should forgive him too, don't you think?" Lorraine shook her head. "You cannot bring this man back to life." No, I can't. I understand that. But I granted him a wish." Chapter 17. Thankfully, Sonny's aunts were suckers for fairy tales. They believed that every life should culminate in a fairy tale, and they spent their own lives trying to make that happen for as many people as possible. So it was no wonder they hummed happily as Wickham drove Sonny and them northwest to Loch Moor that evening, a place Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, wouldn't resist visiting. Summoning his spirit while standing on the shore in the darkness turned out to be difficult at first. But when could transactions with Simon the Fox have been easy? "Simon Fraser!" Lorraine's shout demonstrated that even a patient witch had her limits. "You probably made the devil himself pull out his horns dealing with the likes of you." "Come now, my lovely." The man finally appeared just a few feet from the water's edge, looking far too interested in her aunt for Sonny's comfort. With bright eyes and a lurid grin across his face, he rubbed his hands together. The grey lace swung wildly from his even greyer sleeves as he headed for her. "I'll play nice if ye will, aye." Lorraine held up a hand. He stopped moving, but the Lairin continued. By the time he noticed, he'd been bound by the glowing green confinement of 100 Muirs, and every few seconds a clawed hand would separate itself from the light and grab for him. After avoiding a dozen such swipes, Simon Fraser finally stood perfectly still in the centre of the vortex, spine straight, hands to his sides, all his lewd intentions forgotten. "What is it you want from me?" he demanded. "Ask it and go." Loretta strode around him while Lorraine concentrated on maintaining the rotation of power. If either of them or Sonny waved a hand, Wickham would get out of the car and come to their aid. But they doubted the fox would appear with a man about. Seemingly weak women proved to be the best bait. "Remember, if you will," Loretta said, A young bugler you sent to appease the Duke of Argyle." Lovat snorted. "Ma was always more clever than anyone kenned." "The boy," she snapped. "Remember the boy. When did you first learn of him? What of his parents? Remember all you know about the boy." Half an hour later, sad and weary, the three of them climbed back in the car. Wickham turned the engine over. "Where to?" "Beaufort," the three of them said in unison. Chapter 18. Morey woke to a quiet summons in a decidedly female voice, something that had never happened before. He rose to find the gloaming had come to the battlefield once again. The young witch's silhouette, next to a government flag, stood out clearly against the orange and purple of the sunset. The wind teased her hair and beckoned him. None of the others stirred except for Captain McLaren, who sat in his usual place and watched. The intensity of the lass's face as she returned the Highlander stare made Morey reluctant to interrupt. "Bugler," she said, then turned to face him. "Lass?" "Call me Sonny," she said. "Everyone does." "Sonny, I worried I'd dreamt ye." "But you've seen me twice before." He shrugged. "I worried they'd all been dreams." "Ah." She bit her lip and stared at the ground at his feet for a long moment. Finally she spoke. "I found a way to grant your wish. I only hope—" She shook her head. "I wish— well, I'll just say I'll see you in the morning, after." Morey didn't understand. "After what?" Sonny tilted her head to the side and began walking backward, hands open and empty. Whatever secrets she had, she apparently intended to keep. Lightning struck the peak of the visitor centre with thunder crashing almost immediately. Clouds shouldered together to block out the glow of the setting sun. The fine remnants of mist swirled and then scattered like the dance of wispy skirts, and the moor was suddenly inky black. Morey lifted his hand before him, but he couldn't see it. The wind teased at his hair, reminding him what it used to be like to be substantial enough to force the elements to detour around him. Had the lass lied? Had she brought him back to life as she claimed to have done for the missing Highlanders? Brilliant stars appeared in a straight line and grew increasingly bright. His eyes adjusted too slowly, and he had to shield his face. When he finally lowered his arm, he stood before the steps, before Beaufort Castle. The stars were now hot torches high on the battlements. Home. How had the lass managed the feat when so many times he'd tried and failed to leave Culloden? Before he even reached the end of the battle lines, his thoughts would fly away and he'd settle back into his bed. Eventually he'd understood. He'd bound himself to the 79, and so would never leave until the last of them had gone. But whatever magic had created that bond, the lass had found a way to break it, at least for that night. The castle Morey stood before was anything but contemporary. The trappings and carriages were from former times, from when he'd been a boy there, perhaps even earlier, for he never remembered the Fraser footmen sporting white wigs. After so many years on a quiet moor, Morey had to cover his ears to hide from the rattle and clopping of another carriage and four arriving and two more in its wake. When the footmen rushed down the steps, he rushed up to greet them, eager to get inside and see what the witch had in store for him. He came to a halt just inside the great hall. Heaven help him, they were holding a ball at Beaufort. At least 24 young lasses graced the edges of the hall, stripped of every piece of furniture for the sake of dancing. A small orchestra played from above. Rows of ladies and gentlemen in fancy dress danced in proper course with older generations looking on. What had Sonny been planning? An evening with Cinderella herself? His stomach turned at the thought. Was he capable of wooing and winning a lass's affection in an evening? Aye, he was. He'd done it so 100 times at least, but it wasn't his wish to do so again. Oh, what a fool he'd been to hope in vain. What would a young witch not 20 years old, surely, what would she know of real love? Her own understanding would be little more than his own had been. The 19-year-old Morey would have made merry all night. The Morey that arrived at Inverary would have spent the evening interrupting kisses in the moonlight, protecting the sheep from the wolves. But what of the 289-year-old Morey? Since he could not possibly fall in love, nor could a lass truly fall in love with him in such a short time, he might try to make the best of it. Holding a lass's hand in a country dance would be a welcome change from having only a bugle to hold. Smiling eyes, gentle touches, an exchange of whispers, he supposed they couldn't hurt. The tune ended with a flourish, and the dancers broke out in applause and hurrahs. Morey couldn't take the noise. At the very least it was excuse enough to storm through the throng and head for the rear entrance. He would hide for the night. In the morning, when the witch summoned him again, he would thank her for a lovely evening and find his deathbed. She need never ken that her Cinderella evening was so far off the mark. True love simply cannot be found in a matter of hours. With his thoughts ranting around in his head, his feet found their own familiar way through the yard and beyond. Up the road he went, up the road he trod thousands of times, and straight to the door of his old home. It stood to reason that since the place looked just as it had in his childhood, albeit a wee smaller, it could be his again for the night. In truth, the bench his father had made looked newer than ever. Perhaps a fresh coat of whitewash had been applied, and if anyone found him inside the house, he could point to the bench and say, "My father made that bench. I thought it only logical that this would be his house." And if they kicked him out, he would sleep in the barn until the cocks crow. He pulled the loop, and the door offered no resistance. No fire burned in the hearth, no candle. He let his body remember the way and reached out to find the flint box just where he had hoped it would be. The candle's wick caught, and the wee flame revealed the house, his house, every detail magically restored. "Oh, Sonny," he breathed, "forgive me for doubting ye. True love or no, ye are a great witch indeed." The table and chairs looked a bit lower to the ground than they should have been, but covered with the same marks he remembered. How the witch had looked into his mind and found those details he could not imagine. The ladder to the loft felt familiar to his hands. The distance between the rungs were precisely what they should have been. His feet tested each one as he climbed up to heaven, and when Morey collapsed onto his old bed, his form fit as snugly into the pocket as it seemed to fit into his grave. A sobering thought that. But for the moment he was home again, and the sense of comfort sank deep into his soul. The scent of the place suddenly registered, as if his nose were alive once more. With his ears still sensitive from the noises of the castle, he easily heard the tune being hummed from the main room below. If anyone had come through the door, he hadn't noticed. The tune was nearly as familiar to him as his bed, but he couldn't place it. If it was something his grandsire had played, the memory had faded over the centuries. Each note of it had a strange effect on him. When the humming woman began singing the words, his ghostly heart pounded like a kettle drum. "Who doth I love? A laddie doth I love, and who loveth me? My laddie." She resumed her humming. The sound moved back and forth a few times, and then muffled when she entered the chamber below. Morey rolled off the bed and flattened himself against the boards, hoping to catch a glimpse of her through a crack in the floor, but she moved too quickly and was suddenly out in the main room again. "Do ye ken when I first loved ye, Morey Fraser?" He froze. Had she watched him come inside, or had she been inside all the while, waiting for him? Either way, he didn't appreciate being played the fool, and he refused to go below and play her game. Let her wonder if I'm still here. Morey, my love. More singing and speaking. I loved ye well ere I ever kenned your face, and now that I've seen ye, I'm smitten for eternity. My heart fills more with each passing hour. I swear it, and by tomorrow I'm certain it will burst. And he was certain that by tomorrow his eyes will have rolled right out of his head. He could take no more mocking, so he lifted up onto his knees, intending to move to the ladder, but he stopped when he heard the click of the door latch. Heavy boots stomped inside. "Confess, woman." The man's voice shook Morey to the core. "Can he be? Oh, my wife, you love another man." The woman giggled. "I do, sir, and readily do I confess." "And just where is this lover?" In truth, he didn't sound upset as he strode around the room, searching. The wife sighed. "He's in his cradle, what else? And I shall also confess that I have kissed him more this day than I have kissed ye in the past year. I vow it." The pair laughed quietly while Morey's heart and soul wreathed in turmoil. Was it truly his father standing just below him? He dared not look. But if the woman was his mother, how could he resist? Oh, to look upon her face and remember. No wonder the tune chimed in his heart, no wonder the words cut into his soul. Oh, the exquisite torture, the possibilities, but what would either of them say to him if he descended from the loft and claimed to be the ghost of the bairn in the next room? No matter the madness of it, he could control himself no longer. Bumping knees and elbows like a growing lad, he fumbled his way to the ladder, hoping the sound of his bumbling might at least warn the couple they were not alone. He took a deep breath and stared down. The familiar ladder beneath his hands would have to wait for a later inspection. His feet reached the floor, and he turned slowly, no idea what to expect from the silence at his back. But he expected something at least. Instead, he was ignored outright. The two were locked in an ardent embrace, but at least it gave him a moment to take in the sight of a mother whose face he had never truly remembered. She died when he was 4. Her hair was sable and shone in the light of the fire now dancing on the hearth. Her form was as willowy as the young witch's, but for a slightly round belly. Her face was similar enough to his own that she could have been a sister. Morey's attention was drawn to the bedroom door and the baby that might lie sleeping inside. His mother giggled and pulled away from his father. "'Tis no use, Morton. You could kiss me all night and still not win the game." "Drat!" His father kissed her once more on the forehead and let her go. Morey braced himself, not ready to explain, but ready to try. His parents, however, didn't notice him. They walked around him as if they knew he was there, but never touched him, never looked his way. He was a ghost. "Father!" He placed himself between the hearth and the young version of the man he remembered. His father moved to the side to dig through the basket where bread was kept, but he found nothing. "Bread tomorrow, my love." His mother settled in a rocking chair and picked up her needlework. "Oh, my love, is it? With your other love fast asleep, you'll settle for my presents, will ye?" Morton moved to her quickly, took her work from her hands, and placed it back into the familiar basket. "Sarah Fraser of the Boll of Meal, Frasers, you'll not work into the night. You need rest while the bairn sleeps." "Why must you do that?" His mother's smooth brow puckered. "Why must you always add Boll of Meal, Frasers? Can we not just be Frasers?" "Nay, 'tis just the point, Sarah. We vowed to use the Fraser name and no other, in exchange for food we desperately needed. But Boll of Meal keeps us from forgetting we did not begin this way, that we haven't always belonged to him. and I'll make certain our son does not forget it either. If Boll of Meal Frasers brings us no shame, then they cannot shame us with the title, aye." His mother nodded half-heartedly. His father gave her a wink and helped her out of the chair. She toddled toward the bedroom, but turned back with one hand on the wall. Her eyes blinked back tears. "I mean it, Morton. My heart might burst on the morrow. I love him so." She grinned mischievously. "And if I had to choose between the pair of ye today, I'd choose him." Gazing into those sweet, teary eyes, Morey half believed it. Chapter 19. Still standing in his old home, staring after his happy mother, Morey was slow to notice the hand that slid along his shoulder, then gave his arm a firm squeeze. But it wasn't his father that touched him. It was Sonny. "Come, we must go now," she whispered. "This was all you were meant to witness." He shook his head. "Surely another moment or so cannae hurt." "McCann, Bugler. There's more to see." Mist filled the room and thickened around them. When it cleared, they were back in the great hall. Lord Lovat paced back and forth between his chair and the fire. "Morton Fraser," someone announced, and Morey's father entered along with a blonde woman. He looked much older than before. The woman was Lizette, his second wife. Morey had been 9 when they'd married. Lizette was a Frenchwoman his father met while abroad with Lord Lovat. Simon the Fox had been playing the French and English against each other and using James Stewart as the stick to stir his pot of trouble. "I forbid ye to leave," the Lord barked. Morton bowed, then straightened and lifted his chin. "I'm here to collect the favour you owe me, Lord Lovat." "Bah!" Lord Lovat waved his words away. "Ye are beholden to me, Boll of Meal." His father shook his head and produced a document from his vest. "I have your statement, sworn and signed by ye." "Fine!" Lovat motioned for his man to take the papers, then motioned toward the fire without glancing at them. Once they caught fire, he turned and smiled. "Go then, take your French whore with ye." Morton swallowed the insult to his wife and turned away, but Lovat wasn't finished with him. "If ye mean to rob me of a bugler, you must replace yourself with a bugler." His father turned halfway back again and shrugged. "My father means to remain." "Aye, he does, and rightly so. But it is ye who must give me a bugler to stand in your stead." His father's eyes narrowed. "You mean to keep my son?" Lovat nodded, and a cruel smile leaked across his face. "I do that." Morton squared his shoulders. "You can't have him." "I do have him, you bastard, and if you mean to keep him, you must send that one on their way and stay with the lad where you belong." Lizette's hand shook. She nodded and spoke quietly to Morton, but Lovat hissed and interrupted. "She isn't welcome here. She goes, and she goes this very day. The question is whether or not she goes alone." "How much?" His father's voice rang throughout the hall. "How much must I pay you for my own son?" Lovat's eyes narrowed, even as his smile widened. "He's not for sale, at any price." "Then I shall stay, and send the lad away with her." "Bah!" Lovat strode off the edge of his dais and didn't stop until he was nose to nose with Morton. "You've already shown your colours. I'll not have you here to slice my gullet in the night. Go!" Morey's father turned to his wife and swallowed audibly as he tried to hide his pain. "My father will take care of him, and one day—" "Nay!" Lovat's brow danced over eyes sparkling with excitement. "If the lad goes missing, I'll hunt you down and slit both your throats." He pointed to the woman. "Hers too." No one dared breathe as the monster strode back to his chair, sat and gripped the ornate arms. "No fare thee wells, Boll of Meal. Depart this instant, and I will tell your sire he's to see to the lad." You would deny me the chance to see him one last time." Morton's face was flushed a deep shade of red, his voice strident and harsh. "You're the devil himself, Simon Fraser." Lovat wiggled his arse against the wood of his chair, as if he were settling into a deep cushion, but anyone looking on would know he was too pleased to sit still. "I deny you the chance to break the poor laddie's fingers out of spite." Morton turned away in shock. Morey could still see his face and the war of emotions just below the surface. Horror, shame, disbelief. The man never chose to leave Morey behind. He was given no choice. His father had loved him. His mother had adored him. Even his stepmother, after knowing him for a fortnight, had been willing to leave her husband behind for Morey's sake. Everything Lovat had told his grandsire, that Lizette insisted his father leave Morey behind, that his father had chosen Lizette over him, had been a lie. The old man had tried to downplay the betrayal, blaming it on his stepmother's beauty and his father's weakness for her, but all betrayal tasted the same. Except the one who had betrayed Morey now sat in the Lord's seat, cackling and coughing like an old hag. A man hurried forward with a tankard from which the Lord drank deeply. Then Lovat laughed again. "Lord, I was just wondering what might be more amusing. Should I break the laddie's wee fingers myself, or should I turn him into a shepherd?" At the look on his servant's face, Lovat laughed even harder. The corner of Morey's mouth twitched up as well. The witch's hand tucked around his elbow, and she raised a brow in question. "I might have been a better shepherd," he said with a grin, "had I known I'd been gifted with the less painful of two fates." He gave her hand a squeeze to let her know that it wasn't the only thing he had learned. "Now, sonny, take me away if you would." Chapter 20. When the now familiar mist cleared away, Morey was still standing beside Sonny in the great hall at Beaufort Castle. The spacious room had regained its festive decor, however, and the orchestra continued to play from the balcony along one side, even though there were no guests about. He suspected what the lass had in mind. "Oh, thank you, Sonny, but I'm certain I could never fall in love in one night," she scoffed. "And who asked you to? I only thought that since we were here, you might like to take a witch around the dance floor a few times." She fussed at the ball gown that had suddenly appeared on her body, then gestured toward his belly. He looked down at a fine black suit coat over a kilt of the new Fraser plaid. Oh, the set was old enough, but hadn't been created until after the ban on kilts was lifted in 1782. But he was proud to wear it in any case. He'd always considered himself a true Fraser, though he kept his father's tradition of adding Boll of Meal Frasers. It had been grand to hear Morton Fraser of the Boll of Meal Frasers explain himself in his own words, and to know his mother's face again, along with her voice, her song, the words. It was all so priceless. "I must thank you, Sonny," Morey said, as he led her to the empty dance floor. "You granted the wish of my heart." He checked the tempo. "Though it is quite improper, I wonder if you might wish to waltz with me." She glanced at the entrance, then nodded. "As long as Simon McLaren never hears about it, I think we can survive it." "Oh, lassie, knowing I was loved truly and completely makes me feel quite invincible." He grimaced. "Though I believe you're right to keep our dance a secret from the captain." While he and Sonny walked slowly around the room, he would have sworn he heard a woman's voice echoing from above. "Who doth I love? A laddie doth I love, and who loveth me, my laddie?" This has been The Bugler, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 24, written by L. Muir. Narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Copyright 2015-2016 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle.